Hey everyone, welcome to this introductory video to Christian theology. The focus of this video is to set the stage. We're going to explore what Christians have believed through the history of the church. We're going to look at different individuals and what they've believed and why they've believed it. And we also want to bring it into the contemporary world. Why do the beliefs of some of these people still matter? Why should we care what some of these creeds and confessions say? And what does it mean to be a Christian kind of living in the world today? The primary focus of these videos is really to get at why we believe what we believe. Whether you're a Christian, whether you're not a Christian, an atheist, somebody who's not even sure, we all believe certain things. And our culture kind of makes certain beliefs possible and kind of closes off other beliefs. And so what we want to explore are some of the conditions of our beliefs and why we hold to certain beliefs about God, where they might come from, where some of the language about God comes from, especially from a Christian perspective in the history of Christian theology. And really then to address questions of what it means to be a human being, what it means to live in the world, and how we find meaning and purpose, and how theological language can help us do that. So 3 questions to begin with. Why do you believe in God? Or why do you think some people believe in God? What makes it difficult for people to believe in God? And then why does belief in God even matter? I think these are 3 fundamental questions that, whether you believe in God or don't believe in God, are important to wrestle with and provide answers to. Now, I want to begin this conversation by talking about 2 Star Wars characters. The first is Han Solo, and the second is Ben Kenobi, Obi-Wan Kenobi. And they represent kind of 2 different perspectives in the Star Wars world, at least in the beginning. You know, Han Solo later on maybe comes around to believing in the Force and so on. But early on, he represents kind of a different perspective. So here's what Obi-Wan says. This is a quote from him. I think they're in the Millennium Falcon, and Luke is beginning his training, and Ben Kenobi is having this conversation with Han Solo. He says this: "The Force is what gives a Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together." And in response to that, Han Solo says, "Hokey religions and ancient weapons are no match for a good blaster at your side, kid." 2 different perspectives. One sees that behind the cosmos, the universe, the galaxy, there is something, someone that holds everything together, some kind of force or power that holds it together that we can't see. On the other, with Han Solo, what we get is really a trust in technology, a blaster, power. He doesn't want to talk about some kind of imminent force or some kind of transcendent power at work holding everything together. He simply sees the world framed, I think, in the terms of power and violence and struggle. And the means by which you do that is by having a good blaster at your side. Now, why talk about these 2 perspectives? Well, we're living in an interesting time, and there's been a lot made about the fact that young people are leaving the church, and many people are coming to question whether or not they affiliate with any religious belief. There's been a lot of different studies put out by the Pew Research and others who suggest that there's a rise in what some people call the nones, N-O-N-E-S. That more and more people are kind of clicking the none of the above box when they are forced to choose or asked, what are your religious beliefs? So more people are actually clicking that kind of none of the above. And it's caused some people to ask questions about why people are moving away from religion. Is it that they're moving away from belief? Do they not believe in God? Or are they just moving away from kind of religious practice? Well, there's a guy named Charles Taylor, who's a philosopher, he's a Canadian philosopher. He wrote this big book called The Secular Age. It's about 700 or 800 pages. And he's asking this basic question. He's asking, what has happened that made it much easier to believe in God in the 1500s, when Luther and Calvin and them are around, to now, where it seems as though it's much more difficult to believe in God? The way he puts it is that in the 1500s, you could not believe in God. There were atheists, but there were very few, and Most people believed in God because God was at the center of everything. And now we're moving, at least in the West, into a world where it's harder to believe in God. Well, he talks about the shift in reality or view of reality, that in the 1500s, he would refer to that reality as a porous reality. In other words, if you think about the material world and the spiritual world, that these two worlds were connected in some way. One is higher, one is lower, but the boundary between them is porous, so that you could have this interaction between the spiritual world and the physical world. So they would believe in demons and angels and that God was involved in the everyday life. But what happens, what Taylor traces in his book, is this movement to what he now calls the buffered self, that line between the spiritual and kind of this material world has become solid, and we no longer believe in transcendence. Everything is now about the forces of this world. And so he refers to that as the immanent frame. Immanence is kind of presence. And so the focus, and we'll see this here in a minute, becomes kind of economics and politics and science, where we tend to kind of put more of our trust. And I think this can be reflected too in kind of the shifting technologies of our world. So in the 1500s, when Luther goes to post the 95 Theses, where does he go? He posts them on the church door. Why? The church is the center of social life. So posting these things on the church door is like posting it to a bulletin board or putting it on your social media, Twitter, for example. Today, you're not going to go look on a church door for important stuff that's going on. You're looking to social media, internet, and that's where you're learning more about the world. Now, I think what that does is it shows the displacement of the church. The church at one time was the center, and now we could make the case that social media and other forms of technology have moved into that center. And so what is the point of having this conversation? Well, what Charles Taylor wants us to see is that there's been this shift, so that the sacred has really moved from being this transcendent figure, God, who's out there somewhere, but is involved, and that there's demons and angels and spiritual stuff that takes place. And now we put more of our trust in politics, economics, and technology and science. In other words, we look at the world and we see these forces in the world, and we put more of our trust in those things. So we find our meaning and our purpose in these kind of immanent forces in life. Now, what Taylor does suggest is that the immanent frame, this world, is still haunted. We still kind of have this sense of mystery or longing for some kind of spirituality, that even though we have shifted to technology, science, economics, and that increasingly when young people are asked, what is the good life? It's not about a spiritual life. It's about having a good job and having a house and kind of that economic security and reality. What Taylor wants us to recognize is that there's still a haunting that takes place, or this kind of sense of mystery. In other words, this transcendence now is kind of bubbling up in different ways. One of the first ways in which it's bubbling up is in music, in popular culture. And I have a picture here of a metal band, and I've done some research on metal and kind of compared them to religious communities, and you can find very similar things, all the way from kind of a common dress that metalheads will have, a liturgy, actions that they'll go through. They'll get caught up in kind of this common experience when they go to a metal concert. And so that haunting we can kind of see in the metal. Another way in which we see it is on these liminal experiences, or these limit experiences, that increasingly, especially young people, are trying to engage or are engaging in these very dangerous things, like jumping off cliffs, cliff jumping, and gliding, and so on. And why are they doing this? Well, they want a sense of feeling alive, that the closer you can push yourself to that boundary between life and death, you feel something, and you feel kind of alive. And again, Taylor would say that's a part of this haunting, that we're haunted with this idea that there's there is something else that is out there. We see this in the Christian community in the ways in which we emphasize mission. Many young people in the church especially are drawn to mission trips and projects, and I think part of it can be seen in this sense of wanting to find some kind of meaning or purpose, that as we become enclosed within this immanent frame, and as we seek to find meaning and purpose, and we now see it by going out to these other cultures and doing the Lord's work in these different ways. But the mission trip becomes, I think, an important manifestation of what Taylor's talking about. We feel this kind of haunting. So there's other things we could talk about there too, but I want you to begin thinking about what Taylor refers to as a social imaginary. And basically what he's saying is that we live within a culture and a society that is framed a certain way, and there's a way in which we imagine the world to be. What's interesting about today is that I could ask many Christians, if you get sick, do you first go to your pastor or do you go to the doctor? Do you go and do you have an exorcism to get rid of the demons and the evil spirits, or do you go take medicine? And this, I think, pushes us to begin to reflect and think a little bit about social imaginary. In some cultures, they would go to the religious leaders first before they would go to medicine. And in the West, we go to medicine. What does that mean? And how do we now make sense of religious belief in this particular time and place? And I think Taylor would say that it's that immanent frame which has increasingly made faith or belief more difficult as we begin to put our trust in some of these other spheres. And so then how do we make sense of this? That's going to be our question. So why study theology? Well, I want to end with this. I think that theology, what it is developing a language for talking about God. That we're speaking about faith and spirituality and human experience, and we're giving language to that. It certainly is the belief in God, and we'll spend a lot of time kind of talking about that, but we need to pay attention to the language that we use. And how does this language now frame and shape our understanding of who God is and what it means to be a Christian? We also are engaging other people's experiences of God. So we're going to talk about Augustine and Julian and Bonhoeffer and Oscar Romero. We're going to read a book by Rowan Williams. And it's not to say that their views of God are above and beyond anybody else's, but it is a recognition that other people have had experiences of God and have given language to it. And what can we learn from those experiences? How can we make sense of our own experience with the help of the language that they have cultivated and that they have developed? And we'll talk about how that's often very contextual. So to understand Augustine, for example, we're going to have to understand Plato. To understand Julian, we have to understand some of the medieval stuff that's taking place. So what are some of the philosophical tools that we have to use here in our contemporary world for some of the language? For example, to go and talk about having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ makes a lot of sense to people in the West, Protestants especially. You go to other people in other parts of the world, Coptic Christians, for example, and say, do you have a personal relationship with Jesus? And you might get a funny look. Doesn't mean they're not Christians. But again, it's the language. How do we make sense of the ways that we talk about who God is? And then theology can become a way of kind of framing our engagement of the world. Calvin is going to talk about how knowledge of God and knowledge of self are intertwined with one another. So as we think about who God is, as we talk about God and theology, we begin to make sense a little bit of who we are, and it helps us then engage some of the issues of our own world. So these are the things that we want to talk about. This has been a video just to kind of set the stage, and from here we'll begin kind of moving into the patristic Christians, some of the very early Christians, some of the creeds, some of the issues that they get into, and the beginning of some of the language and philosophical tools that get used to kind of make sense of who God is.